Bonjour, merci d'être là ce matin. Merci infiniment Susannah Heschel d'être avec nous ce matin. Hier soir, nous avons eu le grand plaisir de vous recevoir pour un grand entretien dans le cadre du festival Notre Haggadah et du podcast du même nom. Et nous sommes très heureux de vous avoir ce matin pour une conférence inédite, n'est-ce pas, que vous avez écrite spécialement autour du thème donc, du festival Notre Haggadah, qui est l'art de la joie, et que vous avez intitulé, je le dis en français, excusez-moi, qui se réjouit, joie, genre et expérience religieuse dans le judaïsme. Quelques mots pour vous présenter. Susannah Heschel, vous êtes Ellie M. Black Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies à Dartmouth College, où vous dirigez le programme d'études juives. Vous êtes également Visiting Professor à Harvard University. Et vous êtes, bien sûr, une figure majeure du féminisme juif, notamment comme éditrice en 1983 de l'ouvrage On Being a Jewish Feminist, a Reader. Vous êtes également chercheuse sur le sujet des Juifs allemands au XIXe et XXe siècle. Et vous avez notamment écrit The Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologians and the Bible in Nazi Germany, et œuvré à faire connaître la pensée de votre père et penseur et théologien, Abraham Heschel. Et très récemment, vous avez coécrit avec Sarah Imhoff l'ouvrage The Woman Question in Jewish Studies. Voilà, qui vient de paraître chez Princeton University Press et que vous pouvez trouver dans notre librairie. Je vous laisse tout de suite la parole et je vous remercie infiniment encore de votre présence avec nous hier et aujourd'hui. Merci Susannah.
Merci beaucoup and bonjour everybody. Can you hear me? Good. So we're a nice small group and I hope we can have a nice conversation together. I was asked to speak about cultivating joy in Judaism, and I think it's an intriguing topic because the concept of joy, the experience really of joy, is so important in various respects. So, for example, let's begin with Shabbat. Today is Friday, so we're getting ready for Shabbat. And Shabbat is supposed to be both a day of rest and a day of joy. There are in the Mishnah very clear rules about rest, that is, the work that is to be avoided. There are categories of work that are associated with the building of the Mishkan, which is what we read about in the Torah portion this coming Shabbat. And that work to construct the Mishkan, precisely the categories of work that we have to avoid in order to achieve rest. But when it comes to the joy on Shabbat, the pleasure of Shabbat, the oneg Shabbat, we don't have particular halachot, rules or laws. Instead, we have suggestions how to cultivate a day of joy. But it is essentially left up to us and our imagination. And I wonder about that. I wonder if there are different ways in which we experience joy during the course of our lives when we're very young or very old or in different circumstances as children, as parents, when we're working, when we're retired. And are there different experiences of joy for women and men? Both the experience of joy and also the cultivation of joy. Do women and men cultivate joy differently? And what about those of us who are non-binary? What is the experience of joy, and how might it be different for a non-binary person? So these are some of the questions that I've been wondering about. I think about it in particular in terms of who experiences joy under what circumstances. For instance, can I rejoice when people around me are depressed, sad, in despair, nervous, worried? Is it possible for me to rejoice when everyone around me is so upset? Does rejoicing require us to be in a community of joyous people? Can I be joyous when I'm all by myself in my little hotel room in Paris on Shabbat, for example? So, I think in part, when we look at how Judaism is practiced, we see that women are primarily the facilitators of the Shabbat that creates joy. So by this I mean, it's usually women who are in charge of preparing for Shabbat, the preparations of shopping, of cooking, of setting the table, of also lighting the candles, which is what inaugurates Shabbat in the home. But then, once Shabbat begins, how do women experience the joy that constitutes Shabbat? I've noticed, for example, in my synagogue, which is sort of called a modern liberal Orthodox synagogue, there are often younger men who come on Shabbat morning with little children while their wife stays home and sleeps. The mother is home and sleeping. Friday night, there are usually almost no women in the synagogue, but a lot of men come. I imagine the women are tired from the Friday preparations, or they're setting the table, getting ready for the guests. But I wonder if the women are the facilitators of Shabbat joy, and whether men see themselves also as facilitators in terms of creating the atmosphere that makes Shabbat a day of pleasure. I also keep in mind that the pleasure of Shabbat and the rest of Shabbat are intertwined. We rest, and yet we're joyous. Can one rejoice when resting? There is something about Shabbat that actually is not a passive experience, and I think that's important in so many respects within Judaism. The joy requires us to celebrate, not to be entertained, but to be active in creating joy, and not simply to sit back and allow joy to come to us. But these kinds of questions about how we practice Judaism also lead us to questions that are theological. So, for example, if Judaism teaches that being joyous is a central aspect of being a Jew, it's also, Judaism teaches, joy is a crucial aspect of God's experience. So we have divine joy and human joy that are different, but they're also reciprocal. And that too leads me to a theological question. If we think about God and speak about God always in male terms with male pronouns, what does it mean for men to have a reciprocal relationship that might be different from the relationship women have with God? You know that Ahad Ha'am, the Zionist writer, famously said that it's Shabbat that kept the Jewish people together through the centuries. And while I think that's true, on the other hand, I would say that there's a deeper level, and that is that it is in fact homoeroticism that has kept the Jewish people together through the centuries. It's the homoeroticism of the yeshiva, of the synagogue, where men gather, where they have intense relationships with each other and with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, with God, who is also male. And the question for us as women, among the questions is, first of all, in the synagogue, why do the men want to be looked at by women? Why don't we have, let's say in Judaism, a service of men, and then in a separate room, a service of women? No, men want us to look at them in their homoeroticism. And I wonder about that. And I wonder what it does to us as women to be, in a sense, voyeurs of that homoeroticism. In the world of the yeshiva or the kollel, where men are together very, very intensively, day after day, studying, learning, and learning in itself is a joyous experience, we're taught. I wonder there about what fantasies run through their minds, consciously or unconsciously, about being in an environment that is solely male, and then being expected to go home and have a relationship with a woman. How does one make that transition from the homoerotic experience of the yeshiva world and the synagogue to a heterosexual relationship at home? Do the two clash? How does that work out? I just wonder about that. Now, all of this leads me to another question, which is the question, are women Jewish? Why do I ask, are women Jewish? Of course women are Jewish. I know that. We all know that. I ask it provocatively because I think about women who want to become rabbis in the conservative Masorti movement. When they go into a rabbinical seminary, men and women have to sign a document saying that they will be shomer mitzvot. They will observe the commandments in rabbinical school, keep kosher, keep Shabbat on holidays, everything halachically. Okay. It also means they're going to daven. They're going to pray 3 times a day and put on talis and tefillin every morning. And that applies also to the women. And that raises an interesting question. If a woman, to signify she's religious, has to agree to put on talis and tefillin every morning, what does it say about religious women of the last 2,000 years who were very religious, very pious, but never put on talis and tefillin? Does it mean that the only way to be religious is to be a man and put on talis and tefillin? Does that then erase the piety of Jewish women? Is it that Jewish women's piety is somehow not Jewish? That to be a religious Jew is by default a man? So I ask about this because so much of what we talk about when we describe Judaism is about men's experiences. And it's almost as if we have 2 different religions, male Judaism, female Judaism. I don't know what non-binary people do in this kind of situation, frankly, and how people make the transition when they are transitioning from male to female to male. And I think it's an important kind of perspective for us to bring, because the non-binary perspective makes us confront the binary system of Judaism and all that it implies regarding inclusion and exclusion. Now, of course, here we are discussing joy in Judaism on a particularly difficult day. It's, of course, for me joyous to be in Paris. What is Paris? Paris is joy. But you know, in the last 24 hours, we had terrible news. A synagogue outside Detroit, a campus of synagogue and several buildings was attacked. Temple Israel, it's called. Apparently attacked by a man of Lebanese origin who was angry that Israel had bombed some of his family holdings in Lebanon, and he went to attack a Temple Israel. We don't know all the details, of course, but it is frightening, and I know you feel that way too here, because it's happened here as well, and all over Europe, and it seems in many parts of the world, that synagogues and Jewish schools and Jewish institutions are attacked. It's also a day of war. And we ask ourselves, all of us, how can I be joyous when so many people in the world are being bombed and killed, their homes destroyed? In Iran, in Lebanon, throughout the Middle East, in Israel, people are hiding in shelters. In a time of war, is it possible to feel joy? And this is, in fact, a very serious problem that's discussed in Judaism. And what I find striking about it is how Jewish sources say that it's precisely at a time of despair or gloom or misery that joy becomes most important. Why is that? The struggle is one that is particularly central to Hasidism. Hasidism, which is this great Jewish revival movement, perhaps the most important, I would say the most important Jewish movement of the last 2,000 years, not only for Judaism, but I would say as a religious movement throughout the world. This is one of the extraordinary phenomena. But the question is, how do we observe this central commandment, Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, of worshiping God with joy at a time of gloom, of despair, and of war? Now, I'm struck by the centrality of joy, in part because in Hebrew, there are so many synonyms for joy. You know, people say that if you live, for example, in a part of the world where it's very cold and there's a lot of snow in the north. I hope there's going to be snow in the future with the climate change, but that people who live in a place like that come up with many different words, synonyms for snow, for cold, for ice. And here Jews, who aren't necessarily living with the happiest history of the last several thousand years, have so many synonyms nonetheless for joy. And you know, we have it recited if you're at a wedding. The last of the Sheva brachas, the seventh of the seven blessings at the wedding. Sason, simcha, gila, rina, ditza, chedva, ava, ve'achva. So many, shalom, v'reut, of course. So many different words for joy. And I was hoping to find a commentary that might look at each one of those Hebrew words and talk about what is being implied in a unique way by each word, the different qualities of joy that are being emphasized. I haven't found such a commentary yet. Maybe there is one. But I mention it because maybe one of you would like to go out and write a commentary like this and take each Hebrew word and talk about what kind of joy is being described by this word. I think it's also important for us to think about boundaries. Are there boundaries to joy? No, not really, but there are, of course, boundaries to mourning, to sadness. We do mourn when someone in our family, God forbid, has died. We mourn. And we do see limitations on mourning. There's a week of Shiva, a month of Shloshim, a year of saying Kaddish, and then it ends. There are boundaries. You don't sit Shiva for a month, for a week. But joy has no limitation. And in fact, even a holiday, the holiest day of all, Yom Kippur, is said to be a day of joy. Why? Because it's a day when we repent and our sins will be forgiven. So even on Yom Kippur, in Hasidism, a yortzeit, the anniversary of someone's death, is also a day of celebration. It's a day of celebration because we believe that the soul of the person rises in heaven higher each year on the yortzeit, and so we celebrate. And with that, I want to just emphasize what happens, that on a day which we might assume to be sad, there's also room for celebration and for joy. Even on Yom Kippur, I find that striking. As if that's really the most important thing. It's the joyousness, the joy that even the day when we're fasting and praying and repenting, it's still a day of joy. Now, another question is, what does it mean to express joy? We feel joy, but we express joy. And while the Talmud doesn't give us specific halachot of laws about joy, it does give us advice. So in Talmud Psachim, for example, it says, how do you make joy? Well, good food, wine, nice clothes, new clothes, dancing, singing, giving gifts, giving to others, studying Torah brings joy. This is all how one makes oneself rejoice and express joy. And in fact, Rabbi Yochanan, who lived in the 3rd century, is said to have put on special clothes before he studied Torah, because it was simcha, it was happiness, it was joy to study Torah. There is, of course, balance. And in fact, the Talmud speaks of this in Moed Katan. Do not grieve over much, not too much, even for the dead. Yes, grieve, but there are boundaries. But this also means that even when you feel sad, down, you nonetheless, when Shabbat comes, you have to overcome it. How do you overcome sadness and experience joy? And again, we're given advice. Singing, dancing, being with people, but especially giving to other people. If you bring joy to someone else, you find that you're happy too. And I think that's really a wonderful insight. I actually remember that when, after my father died, there was a rabbi from a Hasidic shtibel on the Upper West Side of New York, Rabbi Tziviak from the Ger shtibel, who used to knock at my mother's apartment, our apartment door, every Friday afternoon. And we would open the door, and there he was with a bottle of wine and a challah for Shabbos. And it felt to me in that moment like something from Shivchei Abesht, from the stories of the Baal Shem Tov, of somebody coming to the Baal Shem Tov himself, the founder of Hasidism, coming to the home of a widow and warming her hut or bringing her challah and wine for Shabbat. The giving of a gift that helps someone else celebrate brings us joy. And I'm sure it brought joy to Rabbi Tziviak to come each week and bring us wine and challah and know that we were feeling remembered by him and his generosity. Now, much of what we celebrate, much of the way we celebrate Shabbat today actually comes from the 16th century, from the village of Tzfat in the Galilee, from a wonderful small circle around an extraordinary person who was called the Ari, Isaac Luria, who had a group of disciples, and they wanted very much to cultivate a Shabbat of joy. And they developed certain traditions that we follow to this day. One was Kabbalat Shabbat, receiving Shabbat, a special service that was added to the prayer book. It starts not that long ago. The 16th century is 4 or 5 centuries ago. That's not old in Jewish history. But they would also put on white clothes and walk out toward the setting sun, watching the sun go down, and sing. And they composed beautiful, beautiful poems, piyutim, for us to sing on Shabbat. Because Shabbat was a day of singing and of being together with friends in a circle, of dancing. The body, the community, all of this is enlisted for joy. Because we don't just experience joy in an inward way, silently, with meditation, but communally and in a physical way, as well as an emotional and spiritual way. Now I have to say that we all know that most tables on Friday night begin by reciting Eshes Chayil, Proverbs chapter 31, the woman of valor. I just want you to know this is also a custom from Luria, and it's really not being sung to the wife of the house to thank her for her cooking and her cleaning and taking care of the household and so forth. They understood Proverbs chapter 31 as a song to the Shekhinah, to God's feminine, immanent presence in the world. It's beautiful and a beautiful custom, but I have to say that I often wonder, it's nice to be praised, but who does the praising? Whose voice do we hear? We hear the voice of the man speaking of the work that women does. I would like to have also the voice of a woman thanking the man that he also cooked and cleaned and washed the dishes and got ready for Shabbat and for the meal. You're all very quiet out there. Okay. Now, it's also true that cultivating joy is not always so simple. It's personal, it's intimate, can be a struggle. We may feel sad, lonely, annoyed, tired, grouchy. How do we overcome that? Hasidism recognizes this and tells us that's why we have a tzaddik, a rebbe, a person whose function it is to help us experience joy. I have enormous admiration for Hasidism. And when I was growing up, I knew some of the great Hasidic rebbes who had come to New York before the war. And I remember them vividly. But I also remember that I had to stay in the kitchen while the men were at the table with the Rebbe, singing, dancing, learning together. And again, I ask, is that joy accessible to Jewish women? And if not, why not? Why is that so difficult for Judaism to give us a taste of that joy? I don't know. Now, we also know that there are different kinds of joys on Jewish holidays. There's the joy of Shabbat, yes. There's the joy of Sukkot, which is very different. Zman Simchasenu, the time of our joy, Sukkot. There was great festivity in the days of the temple in Jerusalem. There was a water ceremony, Simchat Beit HaShoeva, that was very intense. And the rabbi said, and this is in the Talmud, that one who has not seen this water ceremony has never seen joy in his life. That's how much fun it was. And because it was so much fun, they actually ended up having to separate men and women in the courtyard. I don't know what was going on, actually, in detail. We're not told, but interesting. But that's one kind of joy of Sukkot. There's also Simchas Torah, the celebration of the Torah, where we dance with the Torah. Can women dance with the Torah? The Torah, of course, is a female noun in Hebrew. And this is a time when men are dancing with the Torah and experiencing that joy. And again, in Orthodox synagogues, women are on the sidelines watching. And I wonder why. But there's also the holiday of Purim, which is much more egalitarian. Women are obligated to hear the reading of the Megillah of the Book of Esther, as are men. But Purim is a different kind of joy. Simchas Torah is one kind of dancing and singing. Purim is a different kind, where we're supposed to really go into a kind of ecstasy and even drink alcohol to the point where we don't know the difference between Mordechai and Haman, the difference between one who tries to save us and one who tries to destroy us. I wonder why we need to know that difference or what that means, but I'll put that aside for a moment. But what's striking also is that these holidays come and demand our rejoicing. And this is a principle in Judaism. Simcha poretz geder, that the joy breaks through the fence. A joy has to break through. In part because we rejoice in order to reach the Kadosh Baruch Hu, to reach God. Our rejoicing reaches God and tries to overcome whatever punishment that is in store for us. Maybe we can overcome God's decision to punish us by showing how much we are rejoicing. Joy, in other words, has power in the cosmos. Joy can bring down God's blessing and lessen God's harshness. Joy is a form of prayer. Not just the words we say a prayer, but the mood in which we say our prayers, the mood that we create without words. So joy is so powerful. But we could also ask, if joy is a component of the soul, why don't we always feel it? Why don't we always go around feeling joyous? And here, Nachman of Bratslav, one of the great Hasidic Rebbes, was very concerned with this question of joy and sadness. He says very famously, it is a great mitzvah to always be in a state of joy. He says, on the other hand, to be brokenhearted is not the opposite of expressing joy. You can be brokenhearted and still dance and still sing. Their companions, Nachman says, our brokenheartedness and our joy. They're companions with us all the time. But even with a broken heart, we still have to dance. Even with a broken heart. Now, here we see also a recognition, a glimmer of this in the Talmud too. Talmud says that somebody who abstains from wine or who fasts, all right, that's fine. But if they do it deliberately and with pride and say, yes, this is what I want, to be ascetic, to deprive myself of bodily pleasure, then you are a sinner. A sinner, it says in Ta'anit, page 11, by the way. If you abstain from wine or if you fast, it should be painful. You should be in pain that you are pushing yourself away from bodily pleasure, and you should long to go back to that pleasure, because being in a state of joy, that's the normal state that a Jew should be. And again, of course, even on Yom Kippur, joy is what creates God's presence. Brokenheartedness is the absence of God's presence, or the absence of our ability to perceive God's presence. Nachman has a wonderful commentary on the passage. It's in the 10th chapter of the book of Exodus, where God tells Moses, Bo el paro ki hichbarati et libo. Come to Pharaoh, it's translated, because I have hardened his heart. Nachman says in that moment, actually, there's an important lesson. First of all, the passage says, Bo el paro, come to Pharaoh, not go to Pharaoh, implying that God is with Pharaoh. But the lesson is for the Rebbe, or for the tzaddik of Hasidism. And he says, you know, there are two kinds of people who come to a Rebbe. There's someone who comes and says, oh, I read this book of philosophy or science, and it makes an argument that God doesn't exist, and I'm sure, and so on. How do you respond? Well, you say, here's another book of science or philosophy, and you can argue back with them. But there's another kind of person who comes and says, I've just experienced a terrible tragedy. Someone I love has died. I have no words for my grief. And in that case, Nachman says, the tzaddik, who's on a level of a Moshe Rabbeinu, a great tzaddik, doesn't argue and doesn't even talk in words with the person, but rather has to descend to that person's grief and feel it. It's a yiridah, a descent that you make, and you feel how that person feels. You feel in your soul what the other person's soul is feeling, and you lift them up. And how do you lift them up, he says? Not with words, not with arguments, but rather you have to know the heart of that person's soul. The essence of a soul is a melody. And you bring the person up out of despair by knowing the melody of their soul. Not with words, with a melody. Lift them up. So there are moments when, in fact, we feel despair and we need to be lifted up. And we need people who are able to lift us up. And one of the tasks that we have as Jews is to cultivate our ability to lift other people out of their despair. It's hard to lift ourselves up out of despair, but how can we become the kinds of people who can lift other people out of despair and bring them back to joy? And that's the great obligation that we have. There is something redemptive, in other words, about joy. Redemptive. Joy can be the feeling of when something we're anxious about goes away, it's over, it's resolved. It emerges then. We have that in the Megillah, in the book of Esther, after the danger has passed in chapter 8. La yudim harsa ara v'simcha v'sasan vikar. For the Jews, there was joy and celebration. But I think more important is not when the danger passes, but rather how we cultivate in an active way the joy that we need. There is joy in Torah and wisdom, joy that comes to us through study of Torah, through the mitzvot, through a day like Shabbat, that can in fact change our mood. It's striking to me that the phrases we use for a moment of joy, of simcha, especially at a wedding, for example, kol sason v'kol simcha, kol chatan v'kol kala, we say, the voice of joy and the voice of the groom and bride is repeated several times by the prophet Jeremiah. And I'm struck by that because we think about Jeremiah as the prophet who is most melancholy. And yet, in his melancholy, he's able to speak about joy. And I wonder there too, if there's something about moments when we are in melancholy that we can think about what joy really means and appreciate that which we may not have in the moment, but what we want to aspire to come back into our lives. Now, I finally want to come to conclude with a wonderful text by one of the disciples of Isaac Luria in the 16th century, the person who wrote the beautiful piyut, the hymn that we sing Friday night, Yedid Nefesh, which I think everybody knows is how we begin Kabbalat Shabbat. We sing about Yedid Nefesh, the friend of my soul, a soulmate. And that's Eliezer Zikri. He says in a text that Isaac Luria told Chaim Vital, his disciple, that whatever he achieved in wisdom, that whatever he was able to perceive about God came to him as a reward for the joy that he felt with every mitzvah that he performed. The joy that we feel in a mitzvah opens up knowledge and presence of God. Joy is not only for us, it's for God to experience our joy, and it has the redemptive quality. It overcomes some of the bad in our world among us as human beings, and it may bring us the Messiah one day. I'll conclude by reading a final text from Nachman of Bratslav. He says, if you want to repent, you have to make yourself into a new creation. You can do this with a sigh. We never stop breathing. We release the stale air and we draw in fresh air. Our very lives depend on this. The physical air we breathe has its root above from heaven. The sigh begins when you draw in a little extra air. Every exhaling is the death of the moment that has just passed. It's a preparation for the birth of a new moment. So when you take a deep sigh, you release yourself from the old and open yourself to new vitality. This is tshuva. This is repentance, returning from old to new in order to gain new life. And in fact, life is a state of joy. Life is a celebration. All of life. One might even say the death is a celebration, an ultimate celebration. It's a reunion of our souls with God. Life is like a pilgrimage, a celebratory pilgrimage, and death is an arrival, a celebration of the end of that pilgrimage. A moment of peace and a moment of gratitude, a moment of the high point of life as a celebration of joy. Thank you. And I'm happy to take your questions or comments.
Thank you, Susannah, for this very joyful presentation. I took a lot of notes, but I have a very simple question. Do you think that we still can experience joy today? Joy in the sense that you have described. I noticed that several times in your presentation, you slip from joy to fun. You use the term fun.
Fun?
Fun, yes. Willingly or not, you know. And in a society where we are supposed to have fun, fun all the time, It's different from joy, Joy is something more spiritual. Can we still experience the joy that you describe according to Hasidism, according to the Kabbalah?
So, that's an interesting question. I think that actually the emphasis that joy is something to be experienced bodily, in a bodily way, as well as a spiritual ways of the body and the soul. Yes, then fun is definitely part of it. The fun that parents have playing games with children, for example. The fun of eating some new food, of being with friends at the table. The fun of having a new outfit for Shabbat, new clothing. Yeah. So definitely. It's not the same, but remember there are many different words for joy. And because there's so many synonyms, that means there are different experiences, different types of experience. So the joy may be a moment of exaltation. I can feel when I am praying in the synagogue in a special moment, or singing at the Shabbat table, or being with certain friends, or hearing a Torah that I find very moving. That's different from a joke that someone tells at the table, for example. But yes, I think that because there's so many synonyms, it's showing me that Judaism wants us to have different experiences of joy, different kinds of joy.
Bonjour. Hi. I'm at the back, sorry. I have a few questions, if that's okay. So my first one is praising joy so much, especially in a time of hardship.
A time of what?
Of hardships.
Hardship. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wouldn't that also promote dissociation in some kind of way? Like I'm specifically thinking about what you said about what's happening in the yeshivas, right? Like when we see our brothers or friends or dates and stuff like that, like they sometimes kind of feel dissociated from what is happening even in the home sometimes. Through this joy? So that's my first question. And I have others, but maybe
Let
I'll
me
leave.
try and understand what you said.
Yeah.
You're asking about when we are seeing men rejoicing in the yeshiva or in the synagogue?
Not specifically only men. I think even like Joy in general, and the one that we just did during Purim.
Purim, yeah.
We are told to not make a difference between the bad and the good, and it's not even the bad, it's the evil. Like, it's very deep what we're being asked to do, and I think it, like, how to prevent it to become dissociation, like literally always going through joy to process everything instead of like that limited grieving that we're given. Does that make sense?
I hope I understood everything you say, and I'm happy to talk to you privately after. You're asking about Purim and the idea that you should lose the ability to know the difference between Haman and Mordechai, yes? And good, yeah? Who's evil, who's good, yes?
Yeah.
Yeah, Purim is a very problematic for many reasons. And you just named a major one. Why do we want to not know the difference between good and bad? So Purim turns everything upside down. And for some reason, the rabbis thought it was a useful holiday to have one day a year where we give up all of the very serious ethical commitments we have and drink alcohol to the point where we don't know the difference, where we lose that ability. If I were the rabbi, I wouldn't go for that. I would be against it, and I would say, no, that's not a good idea. So it's a day of a kind of crazy revelry, and sometimes it's misused in ways that are very troubling. I also think that the book of Esther is very troubling. The last chapter, and the Jews are finally saved from Haman, and then what do? Then they kill other people. I don't like that. I don't like the kind of sexual abuse that's described in the book of Esther, that Vashti doesn't want to come to a bunch of drunken men, and so he kills her and gets a new woman. I have to ask, why is it that Esther, after she marries Ahasuerus, has to fast for 3 days and ask all the Jews to fast for 3 days before she can even go to the husband and ask him to come and have dinner with her? So what kind of a marriage is that she's so afraid of her husband that she has to fast first for 3? So the whole book is very problematic and troubling for many reasons. I don't have a defense of it, if you're asking. I have a similar kind of sense of repugnance about the whole thing, and especially this year. Is that helpful? I hope that I understood what you were asking, but I'm happy to talk to you more.
Hello, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here, and I've been really interested and emotional about what you talked about. I have this knot that it's very hard for me to untangle about how to be a Jewish woman and what that means. So I'm just going to try to express something that is hard for me to even express for me, and we'll see where it lands. So coming from Christianity myself, I saw this religion as where men were taking masculinity was everything, and I entered Judaism with the sense that it was binary, very binary, but there was a big place for woman, for the feminine, I would say. So I entered Judaism sensing that there was both masculine and feminine, and they were both having a same space, at least in spiritual sense. And I've started to understand that also, may I just say that I've been struggling a lot with me being a woman. What does it mean, gender? And so I've arrived in Judaism deconstructed from heteronormativity of capitalism, blah, 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 and being okay of being a woman because I was like, oh, I finally get it. I'm free. And then I entered Judaism and I'm like, what? So again, but different, yet I sense deep truth in that religion, and I'm really interested. So recently, I've been thinking about why do men have mitzvot that we don't have, and when I entered Judaism, I was feeling like I wanted to be circumcised. I wanted to wear the tzitzit. I wanted all of that men were doing, and I was not understanding why I couldn't do it, quote unquote couldn't. But now I'm understanding very softly that there is so much power in not having to show, and not and in that space that is created in silence, but in the good sense of silence and invisibility, that is making me actually want to be deeply connected to God and tradition in a way that I don't have to show or do certain things, because that rigorous practice of spirituality is in me, and so that gives me power. Yet my other mind is like, yeah, but we should be, why? And all of that. So I'm just thinking about what it means to have a continent, and what do we do in that continent. And maybe those laws are just is not supposed to be part of that sentence, but maybe laws that are given through the Torah and our traditions are just a way to inhabit and to create a choreography, and we shouldn't stop at the difference that it makes between us, or men have more and women have less, but more how can we inhabit that and dance. And I don't know the question, but I'm wondering, yeah, what you think.
Thank you. I appreciate so much what you say. And I understand the not showing, to have there's a privacy. And I think that's very important. And it's something that comes up when Moshe Rabbeinu and Moses puts on a veil. Yeah? Puts on a veil because I think sometimes it means I want privacy. I don't want to be seen at all times. I want sometimes for my face to belong to me and not have everybody looking at me and judging. Does she look happy? Does she look sad? And so, no, I want to have privacy. So I appreciate that. I would say that what you're describing would be very meaningful to many women, but maybe not to all. And part of the problem in any religious tradition is that there are certain practices that are supposed to be for everybody, for every group, for all women, all men, all children, and so forth. And we need to have a greater flexibility. Not everybody can be Orthodox. And so not everybody is religious in the same way. There are different ways to be religious and to express religiosity. And I think we need to encompass that. And that's why we have now the freedom as Jews to express our religiosity, how we think is best, whether we go to pray at a Reform or Conservative, Reconstructionist, Orthodox, Haredi synagogue. I actually feel I was raised, and I raised my children, to feel at home in any synagogue, and to feel that there's something in each one that's very meaningful that I might not find in the others. There's a certain atmosphere that I want to be able to perceive, and that I want to be able to take in to myself, to be nourished by. And I do feel that. I lived at one point in Cleveland, Ohio, and there was a big Reform congregation. And in those days, they had a special Friday service for 40 minutes, very short. And I really appreciated it. It was Reform, very Reform, with an organ or a piano or something. But it was people in that room were really praying. And the same thing when I went Shabbat morning to a Hasidic shtibel, little, what's called ultra-Orthodox, I don't like that word, but a Haredi shtibel. And people there were really praying. It was a very different experience. One was English, one was Hebrew, but there was something in each one that was moving. So perhaps that's what you're saying, is that we need to also have the ability to receive and appreciate the many different ways Jews express Judaism. So thank you.
I have a question over here. Well, it's not, I don't know that I actually have a question. I appreciate your insights and your thoughts, and it sort of connects me to my personal situation and some of the things that the other people have said here. I was raised in a conservative Masorti home in the U.S., and I raised my children as well. One of my sons has married an Orthodox woman, and her family is all Orthodox, and he is now Orthodox. And his wife covers her hair, and and they're lovely, delightful, wonderful people, and I love them, and I love getting to know more about it because that's not my background. And it's been wonderful. But, my daughter-in-law is very accomplished and intelligent. She's going to medical school in the fall, and she's all these wonderful things, and yet she still has to cover her hair. She chooses to cover her hair. She does not have to do anything, but she chooses to cover her hair now that she's married, and her mother and her sister-in-law and everybody, they choose to do these things to, I don't know what other word to use other than to show their subservience to men. And there are other ways of looking at it, obviously. They don't see it as being subservient. They see it as keeping some things private. And so there's a lot of different ways of looking at these things. And some of the other people here have mentioned this, there's different kinds of joy, and there's different ways of looking at things. So it's all about perspective. But at the same time, I look in Israel and how, women and non-Haredi are being arrested for trying to pray at the wall, and the schisms in the society over you're not Jewish enough for, and it's so complicated, and yet, you say that it's okay to pray different ways, and it's okay to observe Judaism in different ways, and we can be Reconstructionist or Reform or conservative or whatever, but obviously not everyone believes that, I think that's part of just the fabric of Judaism. So like I said, I don't know that I have a question here. It's all, who does get to rejoice? Who, you raise a lot of questions, and I realize you don't have all the answers, and none of us here do either. But it's just so powerful and interesting to think about and understand that there aren't really answers. We can't ever have answers. So I don't have a question, but those are my observations after listening to you. So thank you for speaking to us today.
Well, thank you. You've raised actually some very important issues. I have to tell you that, first of all, there is only one religion where women covering the hair is mentioned in the scripture, and that's Christianity. It's in the New Testament. It's not in the Hebrew Bible, and it's not in the Quran. So, and go and look around, and what do you see? The Christian women are not covering their hair. There's the one group that doesn't. So what's that about? So this whole thing with the covering the hair, and apparently it starts in the Greco-Roman world, where, in fact, it was middle-class married women would wear a veil. It was a kind of a fashion thing. You know perfectly well that a woman working in the fields, a farmer, is not going to cover the hair. They can't do it, yeah? So it's also class-based, and a lot of Judaism is class-based, and I've seen more and more of that. And that also is part of how women are affected, depending on the social class. I can give you examples of that, but it's very clear. I also think, though, that you've touched on something. Is it a gesture of demonstrating subservience to men, to mitzvot, to Torah, to God? Is it a way of signifying identity? In some sense, in our world today, it's mostly Muslim women who get to show their identity, not more than any other group. I mean, a woman, and I know this is, here I am in France, and I know that you've had this heavy debate about religious symbols. And in the secular society of France, a Muslim woman covering her hair is a problem. I wonder about an Orthodox Jewish woman who covers her hair by wearing a wig. That's okay, apparently, even though it is a sign. But you can't stop a woman with a wig and say, well, are you doing this for a religious reason or because of fashion or medical? Yeah, so it's all very confused, but that's your discussion here in France. I would, though, point out that the problem we have is classic, what you're pointing to, is the classic problem of liberalism. Liberalism is supposed to be tolerant. Does it tolerate everything, or are there limits? And that's the classic problem. What happens in a liberal democracy when the election takes place and people vote for a fascist regime that overthrows the democracy? Is that permissible in liberal terms? So what does liberalism have built into it that would prevent its own destruction? Well, we don't know. We haven't figured that one out. But I have to tell you, just as a final comment, I had an amazing experience, I have to tell you. So I was on a committee. This is what professors have to do. You have to sit on committees. It's a nightmare. But anyway, I was in a committee for 2 days, all day long, and it was a very upsetting issue that we had to investigate. And instead of using my computer that I do all day, instead I decided I would, for some reason, take notes by hand in a notebook. So I'm sitting there for 2 days writing notes, and a very difficult. And by the end of the 2 days, I had a terrible pain in my hand. It hurt. It was so bad that I went to the orthopedic urgent care to see a doctor, which who does that? Well, the doctor's name was Dr. Nasrallah. Dr. Nasrallah, Lebanon, right? Hezbollah. Nasrallah is the head of Hezbollah, yeah? I think Dr. Nasrallah. Well, guess what? He told me that his grandparents had come from Lebanon to the United States, and 2 of the brothers from that generation married women in America who were Irish Catholic, and they became Catholic, and one of them had a son, and the son fell in love with an Orthodox Jewish woman. And he took out his phone and he showed me the photographs of his cousin who was married to a woman wearing a sheitel and the man had become a rabbi in New Orleans. And I thought, here's this doctor. One cousin is a Nasrallah, head of Hezbollah over there, and the other one is a cousin who's an Orthodox rabbi in Louisiana. Isn't that amazing? So, yes, so it happens even to a Nasrallah. That's what you're describing. Your son marrying a woman who's, yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, the name, by the time it was that generation, his name was no longer Nasrallah, but I can imagine a Rabbi Nasrallah. That would be something. Only in America. Any other questions or comments?
Thank you very much. It was really, really nice. Unless I missed it, you didn't talk about comedy, and I think there's
about what?
Comedy or like
comedy.
And like how having fun, also like making fun of worse situation. I don't know if it's the right word. So I'm just curious to have you, because you are a very fun person. So you put comedy in a lot of your. Yesterday already you did that, and now you do that. So like I'm just curious, like how in the debate and in the presentation and conversation we're having now, like where do you see comedy and I don't know how to say in English, like second degree, like. Taking like bad stuff and trying to turn them around.
Oh, that's really interesting. And I'm a little intimidated because I know there's something called comédie française, right? Which is something very specialized. But I would say, actually, you know, you bring to mind what we do on Purim, which is we tell what's called Purim Torah, which is sort of nonsense. Now, what's a Purim Torah? Purim Torah is something like, what makes the cup of tea sweet? Is it the sugar or the stirring? Because if you put in the sugar and you don't stir, it's not sweet. But if you stir without the sugar, it's also not sweet. It's not funny, is it? Okay. That is comedy for Purim. I don't know. Purim Torah. I think there is, there's a lot of Jewish humor. A lot of it is funny about, different kinds of Jews. German Jews who were very uptight, and Jews who were from Eastern Europe who were much more relaxed, and things like that. I mean, I could tell you jokes, but a lot of it also has to do with where we're living, because a lot of the issue for Jews is the fact that we've lived in diaspora. And living in diaspora is not just a political situation where we are without our own sovereignty. It's also become something existential, that my life is a life of exile. I live in exile. And what does that do to me as a person? How does it change the way I view myself, how I think, and how I understand the world that surrounds me? And that, I think, varies considerably to this day, depending on where Jews are living. So comedy, I would say, in Jewish terms, also has to do with the relationship between Jews and the surrounding culture. Do we look up to that culture? Do we look down on that culture? Do we integrate? Do we have a certain distance? Are we weird? Or are we, in some sense, there was a moment in American history, which everybody says now is over, the kind of golden era, where being Jewish was a kind of a metaphor for everybody. That is, the state of being an ethnic group, whether you are Italian or Russian or Asian or whatever you are, you're an ethnic group. And somehow that Jewish experience was in movies and television programs and even in advertisements. There used to be an ad for bread, Levy's rye bread. You can enjoy it even if you're not Jewish. Yeah? It was funny in that sense. So being Jewish had a certain positive comedic quality. Should I tell you a joke?
Yeah.
Another one. But this is a real one. This is a good one. But I will tell you, I told this joke once when I went to the wedding of my cousin in England, in Liverpool. And I told it to these English Jews, and they didn't laugh. And it revealed something to me. I'll tell you afterwards. All right, what's the joke? So I hope everybody knows a little Yiddish, because it's a Yiddish joke. So there's a Jewish boy in Poland who decides he wants to go to university. And he convinces his father to let him go, so he travels. He takes a train all the way across Europe and the boat across the English Channel, and he goes to Oxford. And he's studying there in Oxford. And after a few years, the father's getting worried. What does his son, what's happening? He decides to go and see for himself. So he goes on the train over Europe and then a boat across the Channel. It comes to England, to Oxford. He sees his son. So, Nu, what are you studying? The son says, I'm studying zoology. What is that, zoology? And the son says, you come with me tomorrow to the class, to the lecture, and you'll see for yourself. So the next day, the father goes with the son to one of these medieval Gothic stone buildings at Oxford. And they go inside to a long, dark, wood-paneled lecture hall. And they walk down the aisle to the back of the room, and they sit down. And in comes the professor, tall, silver-haired Oxford Don, wearing long black flowing robes. And he comes to the front of the room and he says, Today we will speak about the laughing hyena. And the father turns to his son and he pinches him. Wo sucht er? Sucht das Hein, wir reden über die lachende Hyena. He's translating. You get it? The laughing hyena lives in a hole under the earth. Wo sucht er? Sucht, dass der lachende Hyena lebt in der lachende Erde. The laughing hyena eats only carcasses. Wo sucht er? Sucht, dass der lachende Hyena esst nur Neveles. The laughing hyena digests its food only once a week. Dus de lachende hyena krijgt nur einmal in der Woche. The laughing hyena meets its mate only once a year. De lachende hyena geht zu seinem Weib nur einmal in der Jahr. The father sits back, and after a while, he's just listening, and he looks a little upset, and the lecture comes to an end, and the professor leaves the room, and the son turns to his father, and he says, "What's the matter? You look so upset. What is it?" And the father says to the son, "Tut mir a teuve. Do me a favor. Geh zu deinem Lehrer, go to your teacher, und frag them and ask him, is de lachende hyena lebt in de lachende Erde. Und is de lachende hyena esst nur Neveles. Und is de lachende hyena geht zu seinem Weib nur einmal in der Jahr. Und is de lachende hyena kackt nur einmal in der Woche. Sag schon mir, was hat zu lachen? What does he have to laugh about? What does he have to laugh about? Ha! Now, that's the basic question. Why is it called a laughing hyena? I don't, what? With all of this, who needs that? Why? What does he have to laugh about? Well, it's a basic fundamental, it's like the basic, okay. But of course, it's the contrast of the Oxford Dawn, the professor, speaking in this British accent, and the Yiddish who was asking, in Yiddish. Now, I told this joke in Liverpool to these English Jews who was about to become a part of my family, getting married, and nobody laughed. I thought they would think it was hilarious. And here in England, I have a joke said in England, everybody would laugh. In America, they laugh, and here I'm in England, they'll really laugh. Nobody laughed. And I tried to, why? And then I realized, because in some sense, these Jews aspire to be British. They don't think it's funny. That's what they want to be, like that Oxford Dawn. And that was an important observation for me, that in America, there's what do they aspire to? To what? People don't aspire in the same way. And that's part of the experience of living in exile. To what do you aspire? Do you want to be an Oxford Dawn? Or it's just not an issue. Or you just think it's funny. Or you aspire to be the father who asks the basic fundamental question, what's there to laugh about? And so, if you ask about comedy, I think comedy is also, of course, very revealing, sociologically, religiously, all kinds of ways. And that, for me, was an important insight of the differences of experiencing Jewish exile.
Thank you so much, Susannah. Thank you for this moving and profound and very joyful presentation. Thank you so much. This was the second event of the festival, Notre Haggadah, and we are very eager to see you on this Sunday, at Les Cuges, starting at 2:00 afternoon. Okay? So thank you so much. Thank you.